Spoiled rich girl disrespects black judge in court. His shocking sentence silences everyone. Jessica St. Clair thought she could get away with anything. Her wealth, her name, and her charm had always bailed her out. But one fateful day, her arrogance collided with a no-nonsense judge who wasn't impressed by her privilege. What unfolded in that courtroom wasn't just a trial. It was the start of a transformation that no one saw coming. How did a spoiled heiress go from the center of scandal to becoming a symbol of redemption? Stick around, because this story will leave you questioning everything you thought about second chances. And before we dive in, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an inspiring story like this one. Jessica St. Clair breezed into the courthouse as though she were arriving at an exclusive gala. Her gold Louboutin heels clicked against the marble floor, announcing her presence before her saccharine voice could. She tugged at the hem of her designer blazer, a fiery red number that screamed, "Look at me," as she pushed open the heavy double doors to the courtroom. Inside, the atmosphere was a stark contrast to her vibrant aura. The room was solemn, with wooden pews filled by somber faces. A family sat quietly near the front, the parents clutching a photo of their teenage son who had been critically injured in a hit-and-run just blocks away from Jessica's drunken joyride. Jessica barely glanced at them. "Ugh, why are they staring at me?" she muttered under her breath to her attorney, Greg, a middle-aged man whose face wore the exhaustion of having represented her through one too many scandals. "Jessica," Greg hissed, his voice low, "this isn't one of your father's fundraisers. Show some respect." "Relax, Greg," she waved him off, smirking. "It's not like I killed anyone. They'll find me. I'll pay it, and we'll be out of here before lunch." Her heels echoed as she strutted toward the defendant's table. She plopped into her chair and crossed her legs dramatically, the gold anklet on her left foot glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. A gavel struck sharply, silencing the murmurs in the courtroom. Everyone turned to the bench as Judge Marcus Reed entered. Tall and commanding, he exuded a quiet authority that seemed to fill every corner of the room. His jet-black robe contrasted with his warm brown skin, and his eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the room as though weighing each person's worth. Jessica raised an eyebrow as she leaned toward Greg. "That's the judge?" she whispered, her tone laced with disbelief. "He looks like he should be driving my Uber." Greg paled. "Jessica, for God's sake, stop talking." Unfazed, Jessica pulled out her phone, her manicured fingers scrolling through her social media feed as though she were still in the safety of her penthouse apartment. The judge's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Mississippi St. Clair," Judge Reed said, his tone neutral but firm. "I hope you're not too busy to join us for the proceedings." Jessica didn't look up immediately, earning a ripple of murmurs from the gallery. When she finally did, it was with a dramatic sigh and a forced smile. "Of course, Your Honor. I'm just multitasking." Judge Reed's gaze locked onto hers, unflinching. "In this courtroom, Mississippi St. Clair, there's only one task, and that is to respect the law. Am I clear?" Jessica shrugged, leaning back in her chair. "Crystal." The prosecutor began detailing the charges: driving under the influence, reckless endangerment, and speeding through a residential zone. Each word seemed to intensify the weight in the room, but Jessica remained unaffected. She examined her nails, occasionally flipping her hair over her shoulder. The prosecutor finished with a pointed statement. "Your Honor, the defendant's actions endangered countless lives. It is only by sheer luck that no one was killed that night. We urge the court to take these charges seriously." Jessica chuckled under her breath. "Drama queen," she muttered loud enough for the gallery to hear. Gasps rippled through the room. Judge Reed's jaw tightened, but his expression remained composed. "Mississippi St. Clair," he said, his voice icy. "This is not a joke. I suggest you take these proceedings as seriously as the lives you've affected." "Oh, come on," Jessica replied, rolling her eyes. "I didn't mean anything by it. Can we just get this over with? I have places to be." Judge Reed leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the bench. His voice dropped an octave, slow and deliberate. "Mississippi St. Clair, your entitlement is glaring, and it's clouding your judgment. This isn't a PR stunt or a social engagement. It's a courtroom. One more outburst, and I will hold you in contempt." Jessica's smirk faltered for a split second before she plastered it back on. "Fine. Whatever you say, Your Honor." A heavy silence hung in the air. The room's collective attention was fixed on the unfolding tension, and it became clear that this wasn't just a case of DUI. It was a clash of egos. The prosecutor requested Jessica make a statement of accountability. Greg whispered urgently for her to be humble, to express remorse. But Jessica stood up, defiant. "Honestly, this whole thing is ridiculous," she began, her tone dripping with disdain. "I made a mistake, sure, but why are we blowing it out of proportion? I can pay any fine you want. Let's just stop wasting everyone's time." The judge's eyes narrowed. "So you believe that your wealth exempts you from the consequences of your actions?" Jessica shrugged. "It's just how the world works, Your Honor." Judge Reed's expression darkened. "Not in this courtroom, Mississippi St. Clair." As Jessica sat down, still oblivious to the storm she had unleashed, Judge Reed looked over the courtroom. His voice, calm but resolute, echoed with authority. "Mississippi St. Clair, your attitude today has shown a profound lack of respect, not only for this court, but for the lives affected by your actions. Rest assured, my sentence will reflect the seriousness of this offense. And perhaps, for the first time in your life, you will learn that actions have consequences." Jessica laughed under her breath, her confidence unshaken. Little did she know, this was the beginning of her fall from grace. The silence that followed Judge Reed's words was thick enough to cut. Even Jessica, despite her usual air of defiance, found herself momentarily speechless. She glanced at Greg, expecting reassurance, but he avoided her gaze, fidgeting with the papers in front of him. Something about Judge Reed's tone had shaken even him. Jessica leaned toward Greg, her voice barely a whisper. "He's bluffing, right?" Greg didn't respond immediately. He adjusted his tie, his discomfort evident. "Jessica, I told you to take this seriously," he muttered. "This isn't some charity gala where you can charm your way out of trouble." Jessica rolled her eyes. "Whatever," she said, her bravado returning. "He's probably just trying to scare me." The prosecutor called the first witness, a middle-aged woman named Sandra Ellis. Her eyes were red from crying, and her hands trembled as she clutched a tissue. She was the mother of the boy who had been critically injured in Jessica's reckless joyride. Sandra stood at the podium, her voice shaky but resolute. "My son, Tyler, was walking home from his part-time job that night," she began. "He was just a block away from our house when her voice broke, and she took a moment to compose herself. When she came speeding down the street, Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her seat, suddenly finding it harder to maintain her usual aloof expression. Sandra continued, her voice growing stronger. "He's in the hospital now. They're saying he might not walk again." All because she couldn't be bothered to call a cab or wait for a ride. The gallery murmured in sympathy. Jessica, however, leaned over to Greg and whispered, "It's not like I hit him. I just scared him, right?" Greg's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. Judge Reed's eyes narrowed as he observed Jessica. When Sandra stepped down, he turned his attention back to the defendant. "Mississippi St. Clair," he said, his tone sharp. "Do you have anything to say to Mrs. Ellis or her son?" Jessica hesitated, glancing around the room. I'm sorry," she said flatly. "It wasn't intentional." The courtroom murmured again, this time in disapproval. The apology was as hollow as it was quick. Judge Reed's voice cut through the noise. "Is that all, Mississippi St. Clair? Nothing about the choices you made that night? The consequences of your actions?" Jessica shrugged. "I already said I'm sorry. What more do you want? People make mistakes." Judge Reed leaned forward, his hands clasped on the bench. His voice dropped an octave, deliberate and firm. "Mississippi St. Clair, this is not about a simple mistake. This is about negligence, recklessness, a disregard for the lives of others." Jessica opened her mouth to argue, but Judge Reed raised a hand to silence her. "You've shown no remorse, no understanding of the gravity of what you've done. You're not sorry for your actions, you're sorry you were caught." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Jessica crossed her arms, her defiance returning. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath. The prosecutor called another witness, Tyler's father, James Ellis, a tall man with a weathered face. James spoke with a quiet intensity that commanded the room's attention. "I was the one who found him," James said, his voice steady but filled with pain. "He was lying on the sidewalk, barely conscious. I thought," he paused, swallowing hard. "I thought he was dead." Jessica shifted in her seat, her confidence visibly waning. For the first time, she couldn't meet the witness's eyes. James continued, "And now we're facing months, maybe years, of surgeries and physical therapy. Our lives have been turned upside down because of one person's selfishness." When James stepped down, Judge Reed addressed the courtroom. The testimonies we've heard today are a stark reminder of how one person's actions can ripple out, affecting countless lives. He turned his gaze back to Jessica. Mississippi St. Clair, you seem to believe that your wealth and privilege place you above accountability. But let me assure you, in this courtroom, everyone is equal before the law. Jessica squirmed in her seat, her earlier bravado now replaced with unease. For the first time, she seemed to grasp that this wasn't going to end with a simple fine. Judge Reed's voice softened, but his words were no less impactful. This court is not only about punishment, Mississippi St. Clair. It is about rehabilitation, about teaching people the value of the lives they've endangered. And rest assured, your sentence will reflect both. Jessica's heart raced. She glanced at Greg, who avoided her gaze again. She was no longer in control of the situation, and the realization was dawning on her like a cold, harsh winter morning. As the gavel struck to adjourn the session for the day, Jessica remained seated, frozen in place. The courtroom emptied around her, but she stayed, staring at the bench where Judge Reed had delivered his damning words. For the first time, the weight of her actions began to settle on her shoulders. Jessica sat alone at the defendant's table, her manicured nails tapping anxiously against the polished wood. The courtroom was nearly empty now, the echoes of shuffling papers and departing footsteps fading into silence. Greg had gone to make a phone call, leaving her to her thoughts. For the first time since the trial began, for the first time in years, Jessica felt small. The judge's words replayed in her mind on an endless loop. This is not about punishment alone. It's about teaching you the value of the lives you've endangered. She scoffed aloud, trying to shake off the growing unease. What does he know about my life? She muttered. Yet, her voice lacked its usual conviction. When Greg returned, his expression was grim. He placed a hand on Jessica's shoulder, but she shrugged it off. Let me guess, Jessica said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. They're throwing a parade for me? Jessica, this is serious, Greg snapped, his patience wearing thin. Judge Reed isn't like the others who've let you slide because of your family name. He's not impressed by money or connections. You're walking on thin ice. Jessica rolled her eyes and grabbed her designer bag. So what? I apologize again. Maybe cry a little next time? Judges love that emotional crap, right? Greg shook his head, his frustration palpable. This isn't a PR stunt. If you don't start showing genuine remorse, you're going to face consequences you can't talk your way out of. Jessica smirked, but it didn't reach her eyes. She brushed past him, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floors. As they exited the courthouse, the paparazzi were waiting outside, their cameras flashing like strobe lights. Jessica's perfectly curated image was her armor, and she wore it well. She posed briefly, flashing a confident smile as though she were walking a red carpet instead of leaving a courtroom. Jessica, any comments about the trial? One reporter shouted. Do you think the judge will go easy on you because of your family's influence? Another asked. Jessica ignored them, sliding into the back seat of her chauffeured car. Once the door closed, she let out a long breath. The confidence she projected felt heavier with each passing second. That evening, Jessica sat at the grand dining table of her family's sprawling estate. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the room, and the table was set with fine china and silverware polished to perfection. Her father, Richard St. Clair, a real estate mogul with an imposing presence, sat at the head of the table, reading a newspaper. Her mother, Evelyn, a polished socialite, sipped a glass of red wine. Darling, Evelyn began, her tone casual but laced with concern. I heard about today's proceedings. How did it go? Jessica shrugged, stabbing at her salad with a fork. Same as always. They're just trying to make an example out of me because I'm rich. Her father lowered his newspaper and fixed her with a sharp gaze. Jessica, this is not the time to be flippant. Judge Reed has a reputation for being thorough and fair. If he feels you're not taking this seriously, he will come down hard. Jessica laughed, the sound hollow. He's just another guy trying to prove a point. They always cave when they see the St. Clair name. Not this time, Richard said firmly. You've embarrassed this family enough. If you don't straighten up, I won't clean up your mess for you. Jessica's fork clattered against her plate. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Richard said, his voice cold, you're on your own with this one. Later that night, Jessica lay in her king-sized bed, staring at the ornate ceiling. The words of the Ellis family echoed in her mind, their pain and anger creeping into the cracks of her carefully constructed facade. She grabbed her phone, scrolling through social media for a distraction. But instead of the usual flood of adoration and envy from her followers, her notifications were filled with criticism and outrage. Justice for Tyler was trending. One post featured a picture of Tyler smiling in his high school football uniform next to a recent photo of him in a hospital bed, his legs in braces. The caption read, "He may never walk again because someone thought their night out was more important than his life." Jessica's stomach churned. She locked her phone and tossed it onto the bedside table, but sleep wouldn't come. The images, the voices, they all lingered, gnawing at her. The next morning, Jessica arrived at her yoga class, hoping the familiar routine would restore her balance. The other attendees, socialites and influencers like herself, greeted her with hesitant smiles. Their usual chatter felt strained, as though they didn't want to be seen too closely associated with her. During class, whispers followed her every move. "Did you see the news?" one woman murmured. "Her family's money won't save her this time," another replied. Jessica clenched her jaw, trying to focus on her breathing, but the tension was impossible to shake. For the first time in her life, she felt truly alone. After class, Jessica sat in her car, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The confident, polished persona she had perfected was beginning to crumble. For years, she had lived in a bubble where her wealth and privilege shielded her from consequences, but now that bubble felt paper-thin. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Greg. "Meeting tomorrow to discuss the next steps. Come prepared. The judge is watching your every move." Jessica sighed, her manicured nails drumming against the steering wheel. For the first time, the thought crept into her mind. What if this time, money and charm aren't enough? Jessica sat in her lawyer's office the next day, her polished appearance concealing the storm brewing inside her. She wore a tailored navy dress, her blonde hair pinned back into a sleek bun, but her confidence was beginning to fray at the edges. Across from her, Greg flipped through a stack of papers, his expression unreadable. "So," Jessica said, breaking the tense silence. "What's the plan? Do we settle, negotiate, or whatever it is you people do?" Greg set the papers down and looked at her, his expression tired but firm. "Jessica, this isn't a civil case. There's no settlement here. Judge Reed isn't interested in your money or your family's influence. What he's interested in is whether or not you learn something from this." Jessica scoffed, leaning back in her chair. "Learn what? That people are overly dramatic? I didn't even hit the kid." Greg leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You're not getting it. This isn't about whether you hit someone or not. It's about your reckless disregard for the law, for other people's safety, and for the fact that actions have consequences." Jessica rolled her eyes. "Spare me the lecture, Greg." Greg sighed, pushing the papers toward her. "Fine then. Let's talk about what Judge Reed just approved." Jessica's brow furrowed as she picked up the document. It was an official notice detailing her court-ordered community service, 500 hours at Hope Haven Rehabilitation Center. "Wait," Jessica said, her voice rising. "This isn't serious. They're making me work with—" She paused, her lips curling slightly. "Those people," Greg's jaw tightened. "Those people, as you put it, are victims of drunk drivers, Jessica. Some are paralyzed, others have lost loved ones. This is your chance to understand the damage caused by actions like yours." Jessica threw the papers onto the desk. "This is insane. What am I supposed to do there? Mop floors?" "Maybe," Greg said, his tone sharp. "Or maybe you'll listen to their stories and realize this isn't about you." 2 days later, Jessica found herself standing outside Hope Haven Rehabilitation Center. The building was a modest structure surrounded by a neatly kept garden, a stark contrast to the luxurious setting she was used to. The faint scent of antiseptic hung in the air, mingling with the sound of distant laughter from a group of patients practicing physical therapy in the courtyard. Jessica adjusted her oversized sunglasses, trying to shield herself from the reality in front of her. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "You're on your own." The center's director, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Hughes, greeted Jessica with a firm handshake. Patricia's graying hair was pulled into a bun, and her sharp eyes seemed to see right through Jessica. "You're late," Patricia said, glancing at her watch. Jessica's mouth tightened. "Traffic." Patricia didn't respond, instead handing Jessica a name badge that read, "Volunteer Jessica St. Clair." "We're glad you're here," Patricia said flatly, though her tone lacked warmth. "Let's get started." Patricia led Jessica down a narrow hallway lined with photos of smiling patients and staff. "You'll start by shadowing one of our team members," Patricia explained. "Your first task is simple: Assist with meal service. Meal service. Jessica repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. You're kidding. Patricia stopped abruptly and turned to face her. Does this look like a joke to you, Mississippi St. Clair? Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but stopped when Patricia's gaze didn't waver. For once, Jessica felt outmatched. She nodded silently. Patricia handed her off to a young nurse named Angela, who greeted Jessica with a warm smile. Welcome to the team, Angela said cheerfully. Let me show you the ropes. Jessica followed Angela to the dining hall, where patients were gathered at tables, many in wheelchairs or with visible injuries. The smell of hospital food was a far cry from the gourmet meals Jessica was accustomed to. You'll be helping me serve today, Angela explained, handing Jessica a tray. Just take it table by table and make sure everyone has what they need. Jessica stared at the tray as though it were radioactive. You're serious? Angela laughed lightly. Oh, you'll get the hang of it. As Jessica approached the first table, her heels clicking against the tiled floor, an elderly man in a wheelchair looked up at her. His name tag read Walter. New volunteer? Walter asked, his voice gravelly but kind. Jessica forced a smile. Yeah, something like that. Walter chuckled. You'll love it here. We're a good bunch. Jessica nodded politely, placing a tray of food in front of him. But as she moved to the next table, she caught snippets of conversation from nearby patients. Did you hear about her? One woman whispered. She's the one who almost killed that boy. Jessica's face burned, but she kept her head high, pretending not to hear. Still, the words clung to her, heavier with each step. Hours later, Jessica found herself in the break room, her feet aching and her patience worn thin. She sank into a chair, pulling out her phone to distract herself. Angela walked in, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Jessica and sat down across from her. So, how's your first day? Jessica rolled her eyes. This is ridiculous. I don't belong here. Angela sipped her coffee, studying Jessica thoughtfully. You know, most people here didn't choose to be in this situation. Maybe you could learn something from them. Jessica snorted. Learn what? How to eat hospital food. Angela's expression didn't waver. Maybe you could learn about resilience, about consequences, about how your actions affect other people. Jessica didn't respond, staring down at her coffee. For the first time, she had nothing to say. That evening, as Jessica left the center, she noticed a young boy in a wheelchair being pushed by his mother. He couldn't have been older than 10, his leg encased in braces similar to Tyler's. The boy smiled as he passed her, and Jessica felt a strange pang in her chest. She turned away quickly, climbing into her car and gripping the steering wheel tightly. Her mind replayed the boy's smile, Walter's laugh, and the whispers in the dining hall. For years, Jessica had lived in a world where her actions didn't matter, where problems were swept away by money or charm. But here, in this quiet and unassuming place, the consequences of carelessness were all too real. As she drove home, the weight of her privilege pressed down on her. For the first time, Jessica wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was something she needed to learn after all. Jessica awoke the next morning to the sound of her alarm, a grating buzz that jolted her out of a restless sleep. Her bed, a plush canopy adorned with satin sheets, suddenly felt less inviting. She stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying fragments of yesterday, Walter's warm laugh, the whispers in the dining hall, and the young boy in the wheelchair. She had shrugged it off last night as exhaustion, a fleeting moment of vulnerability, but now, in the quiet stillness of her room, it lingered like a weight she couldn't shake. With a resigned sigh, she threw back the covers and got ready for another day at Hope Haven. When Jessica arrived at the center, Patricia was waiting for her in the lobby, clipboard in hand. Good morning, Mississippi St. Clair, she said curtly. I hope you're ready for today's assignment. Jessica plastered on a fake smile. Always. Patricia didn't return the smile. You'll be assisting in the therapy sessions today. It'll give you a chance to interact with some of our long-term patients. Therapy sessions? Jessica repeated, her brow furrowing. What am I supposed to do there? I'm not a therapist. You're there to observe and help as needed, Patricia replied, and perhaps to listen. Now follow me. The therapy room was bright and welcoming, with large windows that let in streams of natural light. Patients sat in a circle, their faces a mix of determination and weariness. Some were missing limbs. Others bore scars that told stories of pain and survival. Jessica hesitated at the door, suddenly aware of her perfectly intact body, her designer clothes, her unscathed life. Patricia introduced her to the therapist, a gentle woman named Clara, who greeted Jessica with a firm handshake. "Welcome, Jessica. Feel free to join us. Today, we're sharing stories about resilience." Jessica sat in an empty chair at the edge of the circle, feeling like an intruder in a sacred space. The session began with Walter, the elderly man Jessica had served in the dining hall the day before. He leaned forward in his wheelchair, his voice steady as he spoke. "I was in an accident 10 years ago," Walter began. "Drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into my car. I lost my wife that day, and my legs a week later." Jessica's stomach turned as Walter continued, his words raw and unflinching. He spoke of the dark days that followed, the anger, the grief, and the long road to acceptance. But what struck Jessica the most was his resilience, the way he had rebuilt his life despite the pain. "I'm still here," Walter concluded, his voice firm. "And I'm not wasting another second of the time I've got left." Next, Clara introduced Tyler, the boy Jessica had seen the day before. He wheeled himself into the circle, his braces visible under his shorts. His mother sat beside him, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. Tyler's voice was quiet but unwavering. "I was hit by a car while walking home from work. It was fast, and I didn't see it coming. Next thing I knew, I was in the hospital, and the doctor said I might not walk again." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She looked down at her hands, unable to meet Tyler's gaze. "But I'm not giving up," Tyler said, his eyes shining with determination. "I'm going to keep trying, even if it takes years." The room erupted into applause, but Jessica couldn't bring herself to clap. Her heart pounded as she realized the enormity of what Tyler had endured and what she had nearly caused. As the session ended, Clara turned to Jessica. "Would you like to share anything, Jessica?" Jessica's head shot up, her heart racing. "Me? No. I'm just here to observe." "That's okay," Clara said gently. "But if you ever feel like sharing, this is a safe space." Jessica nodded, relieved that the spotlight had passed. But inside, she felt exposed. For the first time, she was beginning to see the faces behind the consequences of her actions, and it unsettled her in ways she couldn't articulate. After the session, Walter approached Jessica as she lingered by the door. "Not what you expected, huh?" he said, his tone kind. Jessica managed a small smile. "Not exactly." Walter studied her for a moment. "You know, everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what you do after." Jessica swallowed hard. "I don't think everyone's ready to forgive me just yet." "Forgiveness isn't about them," Walter said. "It's about you. You can't change what happened, but you can decide what kind of person you want to be moving forward." His words stayed with Jessica as she left the center that day. They followed her home, echoing in her mind as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. Jessica's days at Hope Haven began to follow a pattern: serving meals, assisting in therapy sessions, and listening to stories that forced her to confront the reality of her actions. At first, she approached the tasks with reluctance, but slowly, something began to shift. She found herself lingering longer in conversations, asking questions, and offering smiles that, for the first time, felt genuine. The patients, once strangers, were becoming people she cared about, and their resilience, their strength, was beginning to chip away at the wall she had built around herself. One evening, as Jessica scrolled through social media, she paused on a picture of herself leaving the courtroom. The caption read, "Jessica St. Clair, too rich to care." For the first time, she didn't feel anger or indignation. She felt shame. Closing the app, she stared at her reflection in the screen. Who had she been? And who was she becoming? The answers weren't clear, but for the first time in years, Jessica St. Clair wanted to find out. The morning sunlight filtered through the windows of Hope Haven as Jessica walked into the center. She was no longer greeted by whispers and sidelong glances. Instead, there were nods of acknowledgement, even faint smiles. The subtle change unsettled her. She didn't know if it meant they were beginning to accept her or if she was simply fading into the rhythm of the place. Either way, it felt unfamiliar. Her heels clicked softly on the tiled floor as she made her way to the dining hall. Today, her usual confidence felt hollow, her movements slower, more deliberate. As she entered the hall, she noticed Walter waving her over. "Jessica," Walter called, his voice warm but commanding. "Over here." She hesitated for a moment before heading toward his table, balancing a tray of food. "Good morning, Walter," she said, her voice softer than usual. Walter grinned. "You're starting to look like one of us, you know." Jessica managed a faint smile, setting his tray down. "Not sure if that's a compliment." "It is," Walter said firmly. means you're sticking around, even when it's tough. As Jessica moved to the next table, she saw a familiar face. Tyler, the boy who had been hit by a reckless driver. He was with his mother, who was helping him adjust his wheelchair. Tyler's gaze caught hers, and for a brief moment, she froze. "Hi," Tyler said, his voice shy but direct. Jessica swallowed, unsure of what to say. "Hi," she replied, her tone uncertain. His mother looked up, her expression cool but not hostile. "You're Jessica, right?" Jessica nodded slowly, feeling the weight of their gaze. "Yes, I am." Tyler tilted his head, studying her. "You were at the therapy session yesterday." "I was," Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was an uncomfortable silence before Tyler's mother spoke. "You're one of the volunteers?" Jessica hesitated. "Something like that." Tyler smiled faintly, breaking the tension. "I think it's cool you're here. A lot of people wouldn't bother." Jessica blinked, startled by his kindness. She had expected anger, resentment, maybe even disdain. But Tyler's words were simply genuine, and they pierced through her defenses. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice catching. After finishing her shift in the dining hall, Jessica sat alone in the break room, her thoughts racing. Tyler's words replayed in her mind, each one chipping away at the narrative she had built around herself. She thought about the therapy sessions, the stories of resilience, and the faces of the people she had met. These weren't just strangers. They were survivors, fighters, and she had nearly been the reason Tyler's story ended before it had truly begun. Patricia entered the break room, her usual clipboard in hand. "Jessica," she said, her tone brisk. "We need an extra set of hands in physical therapy. You up for it?" Jessica looked up, her expression conflicted. "I guess." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't sound very enthusiastic." Jessica sighed, standing up. "I'll do it." The physical therapy room was a hive of activity. Patients worked with therapists to rebuild strength, their faces etched with determination. Jessica was paired with Angela, who was assisting a middle-aged woman named Maria. Maria had lost the use of her left arm in a car accident and was struggling to regain mobility. "Jessica," Angela said, "you can help Maria with her stretches. Just follow my lead." Jessica nodded, feeling out of her depth but determined not to let it show. She knelt beside Maria, mimicking Angela's movements as they gently guided Maria's arm through a series of exercises. Maria winced, her breathing shallow. "It hurts," she said softly. "I know," Angela replied, her voice soothing. "But you're doing great. Just a little more." Jessica watched, her heart tightening. She hadn't considered the physical toll of recovery, the pain these patients endured every day. She felt a pang of guilt, remembering how easily she had dismissed her own actions as a mistake. "Take your time," Jessica said quietly, surprising herself. Maria glanced at her, offering a faint smile, and Jessica felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. After the session, Jessica lingered in the therapy room, watching as patients laughed and encouraged one another. The camaraderie was infectious, and for the first time, she felt a strange sense of belonging. "Jessica," a voice called from behind. She turned to see Clara, the therapist, approaching her. "You did well today," Clara said, her smile kind. Jessica shrugged. "I just followed your lead. Sometimes that's all it takes," Clara said. She paused, studying Jessica for a moment. "Have you thought about what we talked about? About sharing your story?" Jessica tensed, her defenses rising. "I don't think anyone here wants to hear from me." "You'd be surprised," Clara said. "People here value honesty, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Jessica looked away, her hands fidgeting. "I'm not ready." Clara nodded, her expression understanding. "That's okay. But when you are, we'll be here." That night, Jessica sat in her car in the center's parking lot, the keys dangling from the ignition. She stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror, her perfectly styled hair and flawless makeup now feeling like a mask. She thought about Tyler, about Walter, about Maria. She thought about the whispers in the dining hall and the stories she had heard in therapy sessions. Slowly, the walls she had built around herself were beginning to crack. For years, Jessica had lived in a world where consequences were abstract, where money and privilege shielded her from accountability. But here, at Hope Haven, she was confronting the stark reality of her actions. The people she had once dismissed as those people were no longer faceless strangers. They were her teachers, her mirrors, her potential redemption. As she drove home, the weight of her privilege pressed down on her once again. But this time, it wasn't a burden she wanted to escape. It was one she needed to carry. The next morning, Jessica stood in front of her mirror, staring at her reflection. Her usual armor of designer clothes and flawless makeup felt wrong, out of place. For the first time in years, she reached for something simple, a pair of jeans and a plain blouse. She let her hair fall naturally around her shoulders, resisting the urge to perfect it. Looking at herself, she felt different. She couldn't place the change, but it was there, in the softness of her gaze, in the way her shoulders no longer carried the weight of constant performance. Hope Haven was reshaping her, though she couldn't yet admit it aloud. When Jessica arrived at the center, the air was filled with its usual hum of activity. Patricia greeted her with a nod, handing her the day's schedule. "You're with Tyler today," Patricia said. "He's got a physical therapy session this morning. You'll help Angelo with his exercises." Jessica froze for a moment, the memory of Tyler's smile from the previous day flashing through her mind. "Okay," she said quietly, taking the clipboard. As she walked toward the therapy room, she felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She hadn't spoken much to Tyler since that first brief encounter. How would he react to her now, knowing who she was and what she had done? The therapy room was already bustling when Jessica entered. Tyler sat on a padded table, his braces removed, his legs stretched out in front of him. Angela stood nearby, adjusting a set of weights. Tyler's mother, seated in the corner, gave Jessica a wary glance as she approached. "Good morning, Tyler," Jessica said, her voice softer than usual. Tyler looked up and smiled. "Hey, Jessica." Angela handed Jessica a towel and motioned for her to join them. "We're working on leg stretches today, Jessica. You can help support his left leg while I guide his right." Jessica nodded, stepping closer. She crouched beside Tyler, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out. "Let me know if it hurts, okay?" Tyler nodded, his expression calm. "I'm used to it." As they worked, Tyler's mother watched silently, her eyes never leaving Jessica. The tension in the room was palpable, but Jessica forced herself to focus on the task at hand. Tyler winced a few times, but never complained. His resilience both humbled and amazed her. After the session, Tyler wiped his face with the towel Jessica handed him. "Thanks," he said, grinning. "You're not bad at this." Jessica laughed softly, surprised by the warmth of his comment. "Thanks. You're pretty amazing yourself." As Tyler wheeled himself toward the courtyard for a break, his mother approached Jessica. Her expression was unreadable, but her voice was steady. "You're trying," she said simply. Jessica blinked, unsure how to respond. I am." Tyler's mother crossed her arms, her gaze piercing. "You almost destroyed my son's life." Jessica looked down, shame washing over her. "I know. I didn't think I'd be able to face you," Tyler's mother continued, her voice trembling slightly. "But Tyler, he sees something in you. He believes in giving people a chance." Jessica's throat tightened. "He's a better person than I'll ever be." "That's up to you," Tyler's mother said. "But if you're here to make amends, really make amends, then don't stop. Keep trying." Jessica nodded, her eyes stinging. "I will. I promise." During her lunch break, Jessica found herself sitting alone in the courtyard, the sounds of birds chirping and distant laughter filling the air. She thought about Tyler, his unwavering determination, and his mother's guarded but honest words. For so long, Jessica had viewed the world as something to conquer, a stage where she could shine. But now, she saw it as something far more fragile, a web of connections, each action rippling outward, affecting lives in ways she hadn't understood before. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her photos. Among the pictures of lavish parties and luxurious vacations, she found one that stopped her cold. It was from the night of her arrest, a blurry shot of her laughing with friends, a cocktail in hand. It felt like a snapshot of a stranger. With a deep breath, she deleted the photo. Later that day, Walter caught up with Jessica in the hallway. "Heard you worked with Tyler today," he said, his eyes twinkling. Jessica nodded. "He's incredible." Walter chuckled. "That kid's got more fight in him than most people twice his age." They walked together in silence for a moment before Walter spoke again. "You know, Jessica, I see something in you." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Potential," Walter said simply. "You've made mistakes, sure. But you're here, you're trying. And that's more than most people would do." Jessica smiled faintly. "I'm not sure I deserve the credit." "Deserving doesn't matter," Walter said. "What matters is what you do next." As Jessica drove home, Walter's words echoed in her mind. What matters is what you do next. She thought about all the people she had met at Hope Haven. Walter, Maria, Tyler, and the strength they displayed every day. She pulled into her driveway, her luxurious home towering before her. For the first time, it felt like a shell, a hollow reminder of the life she had built on superficial foundations. Jessica stood in the entryway for a long time, staring at the opulent chandelier above her. Then, almost impulsively, she grabbed her laptop and began researching organizations that supported victims of drunk driving. She didn't know what she was looking for: donation options, volunteer opportunities, something tangible to give back, but the act of searching felt like a step forward. That night, Jessica sat on her balcony, looking out at the city lights. She thought about Tyler's smile, Walter's wisdom, and the hope she saw in the eyes of the people at Hope Haven. For the first time, she felt something stir within her, a glimmer of purpose, a sense that her life could mean more than indulgence and privilege. As the cool night air brushed against her skin, Jessica whispered to herself, "What I do next matters." And for the first time in years, she believed it. Jessica's routine at Hope Haven continued, but it no longer felt like a punishment. Each day, she learned more about the lives of the people she worked with. Walter's humor masking deep pain, Maria's quiet resilience, Tyler's unyielding determination. These weren't just stories. They were lessons in courage and humanity. And each interaction chipped away at the old Jessica, leaving someone quieter, more reflective in her place. One morning, Clara approached Jessica after a therapy session. "Jessica," she began gently, "there's an opportunity for you to share your story at our upcoming fundraiser. It's not mandatory, but I think it could be meaningful." Jessica hesitated. The thought of standing in front of a room filled with people, confessing her mistakes, terrified her. But as she looked around the center at the faces of those who had taught her so much, she realized she owed them that honesty. "I'll do it," she said quietly. The fundraiser was held in a modest hall, decorated with photos of Hope Haven's patients and their journeys of recovery. The room buzzed with conversation as donors, staff, and patients mingled. Jessica stood at the edge, her palms sweating as she rehearsed her speech in her head. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped onto the small stage, the microphone feeling heavy in her hands. She looked out at the audience and took a deep breath. "I'm Jessica St. Clair," she began, her voice trembling. "Some of you may know me as the spoiled girl who thought the rules didn't apply to her. And you wouldn't be wrong." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, but Jessica pressed on. "A few months ago, I was that person. I thought my privilege could shield me from accountability. But then I came here, to Hope Haven, and everything changed." She spoke about Walter, Maria, Tyler, and the countless others who had shown her what resilience looked like. She admitted her fears, her failures, and her hope for redemption. "I'm not standing here as someone who's figured it all out," she said, her voice steadying. "But I'm trying. And for the first time, I understand that what I do next matters." When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Jessica stepped off the stage, her heart pounding, but for the first time, she felt free. A week later, Jessica found herself back in the courtroom, standing before Judge Reed. She had completed her community service hours, but she knew this wasn't the end of her journey. Judge Reed regarded her with his usual calm intensity. "Mississippi St. Clair, I've received reports from Hope Haven. They speak highly of your work and your growth." Jessica nodded, her voice steady. "I've learned more than I ever expected to, Your Honor, and I'm grateful for the opportunity." Judge Reed leaned forward slightly. "Do you understand now why this sentence was necessary?" "Yes," Jessica said, her voice filled with sincerity. "I understand that my actions have consequences, and I'm responsible for them. I also understand that I have the power to do better, to be better." Judge Reed's gaze softened just slightly. "Growth is never easy, Mississippi St. Clair, but it is necessary. This court commends you for taking this journey seriously. You are dismissed." As she left the courtroom, Jessica felt a wave of relief, but also a sense of purpose. Her sentence was over, but her work wasn't. Jessica continued volunteering at Hope Haven even after her court-ordered hours were complete. She began speaking at schools and community events about the dangers of reckless behavior and the importance of accountability, each time sharing her story, hoping it would prevent others from making the same mistakes. She also started a foundation to support victims of drunk driving, funding therapy programs and rehabilitation centers like Hope Haven. Her father, initially skeptical of her transformation, eventually became her biggest supporter, matching her donations and attending events by her side. One afternoon, Jessica sat with Tyler in the courtyard at Hope Haven. His braces were off, and he was practicing standing with the help of a walker. "You've come a long way," Jessica said, watching him with a smile. "So have you," Tyler replied, grinning. You're not the same person who walked in here a few months ago. Jessica laughed softly. I hope not. You know, Tyler said, his tone turning serious. You didn't just help yourself by coming here. You helped a lot of us too. Jessica looked at him, surprised. How? By showing us that people can change, Tyler said simply. That's pretty inspiring. Jessica blinked back tears, her heart swelling with gratitude. Thank you, Tyler. That means more than you know. Months later, Jessica stood on the stage at another Hope Haven fundraiser, this time as the event's keynote speaker. The room was packed with donors, patients, and staff, all gathered to support the center that had changed so many lives. I came to Hope Haven because I had to, Jessica said, her voice clear and confident. But I stayed because I wanted to. This place didn't just save others, it saved me. As the audience rose to their feet in applause, Jessica smiled, her heart full. She had once been a woman defined by privilege and arrogance. Now, she was someone who understood the power of humility, accountability, and redemption. What she did next truly mattered, and she was ready. And so, Jessica's journey reminds us all that true growth isn't about avoiding mistakes. It's about learning from them. Her story proves that redemption is possible when we face our flaws head-on and commit to change. What do you think about her transformation? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories to life. See you in the next video.